thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I would be amiss if I didn't thank some very important groups tonight. First, I want to thank our officer corps. You see the two guys stiffed up in suits right here? They are the twins, Philip and Daniel. They serve with me in Ratio Christi. They give their time. They teach on Mondays when they're needed. And they're just great guys to work with. Love working with these guys. Also, the volunteers. I need to thank the volunteers. You'll see them throughout the night. They're the ones making sure that the rubber meets the road. Thank our film crew, our audio tech crew, actually from crew. Campus crew, yeah, there you go. And a big thank you to all the local churches, campus ministries, other student organizations of every color. You've done a good job promoting, as you can see. I hope this is the beginning of a good partnership with the university as a whole. Also, I want to give an even bigger thank you to Ratio Christi National. If they had not coordinated this speaking tour, Dr. Licona wouldn't be here. So we are very appreciative of our national chapter. And finally, our biggest thank you, I would like to recognize Mr. Barry Sutton, our chapter director. Well, that's really, I can't even tell you enough about Mr. Barry. He's a very special man. Barry had a vision 3 years ago that Clemson University needed to defend the gospel. He said that he was not well equipped at the time. He went, while actually being a software developer, he went and got his credentials at Baylor University. He got them online.
That's not right. It was from Biola.
Oh, Biola. Sorry, Biola, that's right. So despite already working a job, he got his credentials. He searched out the most outstanding officer corps at the time. That was our first generation of officers. And since then, he's followed the vision that God gave him in every way. And really, now we've inherited the work of that first officer corps, and it's because he followed through. So thank you, Mr. Barry. All right, just a quick survey. How many of you have ever considered belief in God? Yay or nay? Just considered it. All right, so those who considered it, who has doubted the existence of God? Okay, our speaker for tonight raised his hand, guys. You saw that? So look around. We're a bunch of doubters. I believe in God for most of my life, and I find new ways to doubt even today. My own story is one of walking away from a childhood of faith, and actually for very bad reasons. I failed to confront deeply held doubts as a student. A critical mass of unanswered questions weighed down on me. And if I were asked, why are you a Christian? I might have pointed you to reasons that other people seem to be Christians, but I wouldn't have been able to give you a good account from the Bible, for the testimony of the Gospels, or why Christianity is true. Sadly, I think this is the state of many of our young people. Perhaps even people in this room are concealing the same questions. I presume the progress of science made ancient myths of God necessary. I thought that all the evil in the world must at least make the existence of God doubtful, if not impossible. Besides, even when I was fully impacted by the gospel later on, it wasn't clear to me that what answers there could be out there for these nagging questions. So that's where Ratio Christi steps in. For those of us who are rusty in our Latin, Ratio Christi means reasons for Christ. It is an international apologetics alliance. They have chapters all over the nation, 150 worldwide, in other countries as well. So check it out. Our chapter exists here at Clemson for two purposes. First, to empower Christian students with reasons for their faith. Two, to sponsor campus events like this, to encourage the study of the intellectual coherence and explanatory power of a Christian worldview. And Ratio is a unique group. It is a place where people of other religions and worldviews can talk with Christians to learn why we believe the way we do. It is also a place for Christians to search for answers, but it's not a campus ministry. It doesn't pretend to be a campus ministry. You ask the officer, and I tell them all the time, Ratio exists as a supplement. We are like a vitamin supplement to the other campus ministries who are doing it so well already. I say go to your crew meetings, your FCA, Cross Impact, RUF, CO, Navigators, all the other groups I forgot already. But when you're doubting and you need to pursue answers, come to Ratio. Listen, Christianity is only worth your time if it's true. And God does not call us to turn off our minds and try really hard to believe by rejecting the truth. Christians ought to trust God in light of what we know. If you need a safe place to ask the hard questions, come to Ratio, because we're all pursuing truth. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but we can equip you with all kinds of resources. Know that there's an overwhelming case to be made for Christ on the philosophical, historical, and scientific evidence available to us. If you're afraid to share your convictions with others because you may get the hard objections, then come reason with us on Mondays at 7:15, upstairs in bracket 213. Next Monday, we're actually going to discuss St. Augustine's idea of just war and how God can relate to violent beings. Our group's active throughout the semester. We're going to go to conferences. Now we're hosting big events like this, in addition to our weekly meetings. We also have a book club that meets every Wednesday afternoon. We're reading Tactics by Greg Kokel at the moment. And if you have any questions about Ratio Christi, if you want to plant chapters in your colleges or high schools, talk to myself and Mr. Barry, our chapter director, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. All right, now let's hear from another officer, Daniel Wilson.
As Nathan said, my name is Daniel Wilson. I'm the treasurer for Ratio Christi, and I know he said Philip and I are awesome to work with, but I gotta say that Nathan is awesome as well. He's been so inspirational. He definitely deserves a round of applause. Okay, so tonight Dr. Licona is talking about the idea of contradictions in the Gospels. Okay, so this, I don't know how many of you have wrestled with this. This has been an issue, but this is a real thing that critics bring up in opposition to Christianity. And even Christians struggle with it themselves, all sorts of stuff. So we're going to watch a quick video of Bart Ehrman. He's a New Testament scholar, but an atheist. He's written or edited, I think, 29 books or so, done tons of stuff, debated Dr. Licona before. So we're going to watch a quick video of him giving some of the reasons or some of the problems he has with the Bible, contradictions and stuff that he sees that can be resolved. So it's going to be a short thing where he's just kind of attacking, and then Dr. Licona will hopefully resolve all those issues in your minds later. So let's watch this video real quick of Bart Ehrman.
My own view is that it is absolutely certain that the Gospels did not give an accurate account of the things that Jesus did. For one thing, once again, there are many discrepancies in the accounts, as you can see for yourself, simply by reading them and comparing the Gospel stories for one another. Take any story in any of the Gospels and compare it in detail. Just do it yourself. Compare it in detail with the same story in another Gospel. You will see multiple differences. During Jesus' temptations, what was the second temptation? To jump off the temple or to bow down to worship Satan? Matthew says the first, Luke says the second. If one of the authors felt free to change the details of the story, how do you know that he didn't feel free to change the substance of the story? Did Jesus ride one animal into Jerusalem at the triumphal entry, as in Mark, or did he ride two animals, as in Matthew? Did Jesus have extensive conversations at his trial with Pilate, as in John? Or was he silent, except for uttering two words, as in Mark? How could it be both? But sometimes the stories are not simply different in minor detail. They are sometimes different in major ways. Let me give you just one example in the couple minutes I have left. Jesus, on the way to his death, in the Gospel of Mark, is completely silent. He carries his cross, or Simon of Cyrene carries his cross, and Jesus doesn't say a word. They nail him to the cross, and he's silent. He's hanging on the cross. Both robbers mock him. The passers-by mock him. Everybody mocks him, and he doesn't say anything until the very end. He cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And he dies. That's the end of the story in Mark. Not quite, because then he gets raised from the dead. But how did he feel at the end? Compare that with the Gospel of Luke. In Luke, Jesus is not silent on the way to be crucified. He's going to be crucified, and he sees some women weeping for him by the side of the road, and he turns to them and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children for the fate that's to befall you." Jesus, in Luke's gospel, is more concerned about these women than he is about his own fate. When being nailed to the cross, in Luke's gospel, he's not silent. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." In Luke's gospel, he's hanging on the cross and he has an intelligent conversation with one of the robbers. Only one of the robbers mocks him in Luke. The other tells the first robber to be quiet because Jesus has done nothing to deserve this. He turns his head to Jesus and says, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replies to him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." In Luke's gospel, Jesus does not feel forsaken the way he does in Mark. In Luke's gospel, he knows he's on God's side. God is behind the proceeding. He knows what's going to happen to him. He knows why it's going to happen to him. He knows what's going to happen to him after it happens to him. He's going to wake up in paradise, and this guy's going to be with him in Luke's gospel. And at the end, rather than crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He doesn't say that in Luke. In Luke's gospel, he says, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And he dies. This is a very different portrayal of Jesus going to his death from Mark. What everybody does, of course, is they take Mark's account and they take Luke's account and they smash them together into one big account. So Jesus says everything that he says in Mark, everything he says in Luke, then you throw in what he says in Matthew and what he says in John, and you end up with the 7 last words of the dying Jesus, which you find in none of the Gospels. You are free to do that, to smash them all together, so that Mark's portrayal isn't right, Luke's isn't right. What's right is the one that you've combined. But realize what you've done is you've written your own gospel rather than trusting any of the Gospels of the New Testament. The problem is the Gospels of the New Testament do not agree either on the sayings of Jesus or on the deeds of Jesus.
As Daniel said, my name is Philip Wilson. I'm the secretary of Ratio Christi, and I have the pleasure of working with Daniel Wilson, Nathaniel Beasley, or Nathan Beasley, and Mr. Barry Sutter. And we are very, very excited to have Dr. Licona with us here tonight. Dr. Licona is a renowned New Testament scholar who has received a Master of Arts degree in Religious Studies from Liberty University and a PhD in New Testament Studies from the University of Pretoria, which he completed with distinction. He is currently an Associate Professor of Theology at Houston Baptist University. Dr. Licona has authored numerous books, including The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach, Paul Meets Muhammad, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, which he co-authored with Gary Habermas, and Evidence for God, 50 Arguments for Faith from the Bible, History, Philosophy, and Science, which he co-edited with William Debsky. He is also currently working on a book about the subject of this evening's talk, which has already been accepted by Oxford University Press, and which he plans to finish by the end of the year. He is a member of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, the Institute for Biblical Research, and the Society of Biblical Literature. Dr. Licona is the founder of Risen Jesus Ministries and frequently speaks at college campuses, churches, and other ministries. He has also participated in a number of public debates, including debates against atheist historians such as Dr. Bart Ehrman, who you just heard, and Dr. Richard Carrier. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Mike Licona.
So anyway, I'm happy to be here. I have been in a couple debates with Bart Ehrman. I like the guy. I consider him a friend. We get along just fine. I think his arguments stink, but you know, he's a pretty good guy, pretty smart guy. Anyway, so when I debated him a few years ago, we debated on the resurrection, and I did my doctoral dissertation on the resurrection, and I was just consumed with it because I wanted to look at it as objectively as I could and look at it as a historian would. And although when I was in grad school, writing a 20-page double-spaced paper with a few footnotes was a nightmare for me, my doctoral dissertation ended up being over... Oh, let's try one more time. If not, could I borrow one of those handhelds? My doctoral dissertation ended up being over 500 pages, single-spaced with over 2,000 footnotes. So I was consumed with it. It was about 3.5 to 4 times the size of an average doctoral dissertation. And I purposefully engaged in public debates with folks like Ehrman and some of the others, leading figures out there, because I wanted to run what I was learning in my research by some of the brightest minds out there because I recognize that as a historian, or anyone, we've got our own blind spots. And I wasn't going to see my blind spots, because they're blind spots. And so, I figure who better than to have some of the leading skeptics out there and run this by in a public debate where they would be motivated to answer it. And so that's why I did it. So I had 22 public debates, and it was something because the more I got into it and was debating individuals, the more firm my belief came that Jesus actually rose from the dead. If you want to see why, just get my book. It's help you get to sleep at night. But during those debates with Ehrman, he would always bring up things such as gospel contradictions, like you saw there. So in both my public debates with him, he did the same thing. And so that didn't really trouble me too much, because if Jesus rose from the dead, who cares then if the gospel had a few contradictions in it? It didn't matter. If Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true, period. It's game, set, match. And my approach to the resurrection, I use literature that predates the Gospels, like the writings of Paul. And as a historian, I can actually get back with a little more certainty to the Jerusalem apostles, those who have walked with and known Jesus. Historians can get back to them with a little more certainty than they can through the Gospels. So if we can show that's what the apostles were preaching, and Ehrman doesn't even object to that. He admits that Jesus' followers had actual experience they believe were the risen Jesus who had appeared to them. So I figured if Jesus rose from the dead, we can get there through the writings of Paul and the early oral tradition in them. And Ehrman even agrees with all of these. Then what's the big deal about the Gospels? He agreed to the same facts that I did. So it's kind of like this. If Jesus died, let's say 30 or 33, scholars are undecided which, but very slight majority go with the year 30. So if Jesus died in 30, Christianity was true, or if he rose in the year 30, rose from the dead in the year 30, then Christianity was true in the year 30, for sure. Well, the first piece of New Testament literature wasn't written until slightly before the year 50, somewhere around 47 to 49, and that would have either been 1 Thessalonians or Galatians. And the Gospels didn't even come till later. Like most scholars believe Mark was the first Gospel, and he wrote between 65 and 70, or 35 or 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, and then Matthew a little later, and Luke a little later, and then John somewhere between 90 and 95. So you have the Gospels written between 35 and 65 years after the crucifixion. So here's the thing. If Jesus rose from the dead in 30, and the first Gospel wasn't written until maybe 65, was Christianity true if Jesus rose from the dead in that 35-year period? Of course. So then how could some contradictions in the Gospels written after nullify the truth of Christianity when it was true before any of them were written? So, and I also pointed out, many people don't maybe not know this, but when the Titanic sank, eyewitnesses disagreed in reference to an interesting bit of data. Some eyewitnesses, survivors, said that the Titanic broke in half before it sank. Others said it didn't. It went down in one piece. Now, how do you get that wrong? It's the most terrifying night of your life. You're out on a lifeboat. You have friends, perhaps, and family who are dying. There's only one thing you can see. It's a little over 800 feet long, and it's all lit up. The screams are coming from it. How do you get it wrong? It breaks in half and sinks. No, it goes down to one piece. I don't know. But no one turns around and said, I guess the Titanic didn't sink. It just means that there were some peripheral details that weren't known. So I think there's a lot too much dismayed over this whole thing about gospel contradictions to begin with. But I wanted to look at it and just say, okay, what is going on here? And so I started to read the Gospels at that point exclusively in Greek, the original language. And the reason I did that is because Greek is a little more precise language than English. And I'm 53 years old right now, and I've been a Christian since the age of 10, so I've been reading the Gospels many times. And those of you who have been around for a while like me, you've been a Christian for a while, you know that you start reading the story in the Gospel and your mind goes on autopilot because you know what's going to happen, right? And when it's over, then you just go on, and then your mind goes on autopilot. Well, read it in another language. Any other language can help with that, but it's really neat to read it in original language. So as I started to do that, I started to notice differences in the Gospels, and ones I'd never noticed before. And so I started to make a list of these. And my Word document has grown to more than 50 pages of differences that I've noted in the Gospels, how they differ from one another. So as I went through those, I noticed what I thought were, I could explain why a lot of these differences were there, but it was kind of just speculation. We wouldn't really know. To be honest with you, I've not been a fan of harmonization for a while, and the reason being is because sometimes it can go too far. Harmonization, I think, can be legitimate in a number of cases, but in some cases not. There's a famous case from 1971, I believe it was, when a guy named Harold Lindsell, who was then the president of Fuller Theological Seminary, attempted to harmonize the gospel accounts pertaining to Peter denying Jesus. In one of the Gospels, it has Jesus predicting Peter's denial of him, and he says, hey, you will deny me 3 times before the cock crows, before the rooster crows. And in another gospel, he says, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. So which one is it? Lindsell attempted to harmonize that by saying both are true. That Peter denied Jesus 3 times and the rooster crowed, and then he denied Jesus another 3 times and the rooster crowed a second time, so that Peter denied Jesus a total of 6 times. Well, that's one of those things that most New Testament scholars just kind of laugh at today and say, that's just an example of a kind of taking the Gospels and subjecting them to hermeneutical waterboarding until they tell you what you want to hear. I don't think that such hermeneutical gymnastics do the texts any good, and it doesn't do good to try to rescue the Gospels, to try to say there's no contradiction or error in them. When you have to go to that length. So I started to figure, well, so where do we go with this? Most scholars today, New Testament scholars, agree that the Gospels belong to the genre of Greco-Roman biography. And the reason it's Greco-Roman rather than Jewish biography is because for some unknown reason to us, the Jews didn't write biographies of their sages in that day. We don't know why. Well, they didn't. And just about every other piece of literature out there is written in some kind of a genre, a literary type. Even when we come to the Bible, we've got that. You've got the historical books of the Old Testament, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. You've got Psalms, which is poetry. You've got wisdom literature like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. You've got the prophetic books. You come to the New Testament, Acts is historiography. You got all the letters, epistolary genre. You've got Hebrews, which is considered by most to be a homily, a kind of sermon. Revelation is an apocalypse, much of the same genre as First Enoch, Fourth Ezra, Jewish literature of that day. So why would the Gospels be totally unique in the sense as they're not going to write according to any genre known to them at that point? It wouldn't make sense. So if they're going to write according to a genre, a biography, Greco-Roman biography, was the only game in town. So if we want to really understand the Gospels and understand what's going on, we got to understand the genre of ancient biography. So I made a list of all the biographies of people made within, say, 150, 200 years of Jesus. And there are just under 100 biographies that have survived. Of those, 50 belong to a guy named Plutarch. Plutarch, much of what we know about the Greco-Roman world comes from Plutarch. By the way, that's a good name. I'm not talking about Plutarch and Hunger Games, all right? But if some of you, someday you have kids and you have a son, you're looking for a name, just remember the name, Plutarch. All right. So, I'm looking at this, and Plutarch writes 50. So I'm going to start with Plutarch. I'm going to read all these nearly 100 biographies, and I'm going to start with Plutarch. So I read all of Plutarch's, these 50 biographies. And as I got toward the end, I started to realize that a lot of these biographies involve people who lived at the same time and knew one another. They participated in the same events. In fact, there are 9 of them, of those 50, that refer to people and events that would eventually lead to the fall of the Roman Republic. So I'm talking about Caesar, Cicero, Pompey, Crassus, Antony, Brutus, Sertorius, Lucullus, the younger Cato. These people knew each other. And for the most part, they participated, they battled against each other, they fought each other in the Senate and things like this. So, as a result, Plutarch is going to tell on multiple occasions the same story, multiple times. In fact, as I went through them and have spent maybe the last 5 years looking at those, I identified 36 stories that Plutarch tells 2 or more times in these 9 biographies. The assassination of Julius Caesar, he tells in the life of Cicero, the life of Caesar, the life of Antony, and the life of Brutus. So you can compare these 4. This is just one of 36 stories. You can compare these 4 accounts of the same event. And why is this interesting? Because before we start to do this, we can look at same events that other historians of antiquity reported. For example, my friend Craig Keener has assessed how the suicide of the Roman Emperor Otho took place. I think it's in Plutarch, Suetonius, and Tacitus. And so you got these 3 historians reporting the same event, and they reported differently. So what a lot of classicist historians will do is they take educated guesses on what sources Plutarch, Suetonius, and Tacitus were using for that, and then they will, based on their educated guesses on what sources those guys were using, they will see what they did to adapt those sources that resulted in differences. But Plutarch offers historians a unique opportunity because it's the same author, for the most part using the same sources, reporting the same stories, and yet differences occur. So as I've gone through these and looked at these 32 stories or 36 stories really carefully, I have found differences in 29 of them. And then you look at these differences, and sometimes they form like these patterns. The same kind of difference occurs over and over. And from that, you can infer that Plutarch was using various compositional devices. Now, it's interesting to note that classicist historians have recognized that there is a universal use of these compositional devices by ancient historians and biographers. So now, by comparing how Plutarch reports the event versus Plutarch versus Plutarch versus Plutarch versus Plutarch, we can see, even with greater amount of certainty, that these were indeed compositional devices that were used, and they resulted in differences. All right, so I'm going to discuss some of those with you because it's really interesting. When I go to the Gospels and I notice some of the differences in there, guess what? It's the same kind of differences we find even between Plutarch telling the same story, which suggests that the Gospel authors were using the same sort of compositional devices. If that's the case, then these guys weren't being sloppy historians. They were just employing the compositional devices of their day, and it resulted in differences. And you say, all right, what are these compositional devices? Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, so let's jump right into it. Let me introduce you to our main players. Julius Caesar, born in 100 BC, dies in 44 on the Ides of March 15th, the middle of March, when he's assassinated. Okay, so Caesar was, and sometimes he was a good guy, sometimes he wasn't. He was very politically savvy. Think about Bill Clinton. This guy knew politics, okay? And he had charisma. People loved him. This guy could get the job done. All right, so Caesar was that way, but there were some things that happened in Caesar's life that were kind of questionable. All right, so, but he, from a very early age, wanted to be the #1 guy in Rome. All right, now let me explain a little about the political system in the late Roman Republic and compare it with the U.S. So in the U.S., we've got a president, and you got one person serving as president, and they serve for 4 years, and then they can run for a second term for a second 4 years, and then that's it. All right, so you could serve 8 years, and that's it. The Roman Republic, the top position in the land was called the consul, and there were 2 of them who served together as consuls. So you didn't have one person with the most power, you had 2, and they only served for 1 year. Now, they could run again after waiting 10 years. So it's kind of neat when you think about term limits sometimes, you know. So Caesar wanted to be consul, and he was consul a couple of times, but Caesar also wanted to be the monarch, the dictator of the land. But the Roman Republic wouldn't let a person be a dictator, okay? All right, so then we go to a guy named Pompey. Maybe some might think, well, isn't that Pompeii? No, Pompeii was the city that was destroyed by the volcano. Pompey is the person. Pompey was 6 years older than Caesar. He died 4 years before Caesar because Caesar killed him. So Pompey he's a pretty good guy. People loved Pompey. He was probably the most popular Roman. All right, Pompey was a great general. He got given the title Pompey the Great, Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great. He was great in the military, but like I said, he was popular with the people, fairly moral guy, was true to his wife. He was not a womanizer. Pompey was power hungry as well. And for a while, at least up to the time of Caesar, for several years, he was the most powerful guy, one of the two most powerful guys in Rome. And he served as consul a few times. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Pompey went out to fight him. And in August of 48 BC, he was defeated by Caesar at Pharsalus. And he committed suicide. So, all right, so that's Pompey. And then there's a guy named Crassus. Crassus was with Pompey. He served with Pompey twice as co-consul. So the two of them did. And they kind of Pompey was Crassus's nemesis. So if you remember Nash and that other guy in the movie, It's a Beautiful Mind, you know, they were at the beginning, they're really competing against each other to see who's going to be, better, like the two twins over here. They're going against each other that way. And so Pompey and Crassus were like that. Who's going to be the better man? Crassus did not have the charisma that Pompey did. So he was a fantastic businessman. He knew how to make money. He bought real estate and all this stuff. And people were always coming to him, and he'd loan them money and get favors and things like that. So he was a very wealthy man. Crassus, a little older than both Caesar and Pompey. Crassus was primarily responsible for defeating Spartacus. Heard about Spartacus in the Servile War, the Slave War rebellion? Well, Crassus ended up building a wall, Plutarch says, about 40 miles long that hemmed in Spartacus, and he ended up defeating most of Spartacus's army, and was mostly responsible for that. And Crassus was killed in battle. And then you have a guy named Cato the Younger, distinguished from Cato the Elder, who was a relative. Cato the Younger, we'll just call him Cato from now on. He was born in 95 and he died in 46 BC. He was a man of great integrity and was really out for the benefit of the Roman people. He wanted to preserve the Roman Republic. This guy stood on principle. I mean, he's like my favorite Roman to read about. He's pretty cool. I don't know that he had some weaknesses. I don't know that he would have made a good friend. But at one point, he had such great integrity, a guy came up to him and said, "Hey, I want to be related to you." And back then, you formed friendships by marriage. He said, "Let me marry your daughter." And Cato said, "Nope, she's already been promised to someone else." "Well, then give me your wife." "Well, let me think about it." And he did. So he's a little strange in some ways. But he fought Caesar to the end, and when Caesar was coming up, Crassus had been defeated, Pompey had been defeated, and Caesar approached the city of Utica, where Cato was. He sent away, made sure everyone was safe, and then he committed suicide. So that's Cato. All right, now we know the main characters, so let's jump into some pretty cool stories here. What I'm going to do is explain some of these compositional devices in light of these stories. So the first is called transferal. And transferal is when an author knowingly attributes words or actions to a person that he knew belonged to another. So he knew someone had said this, but he placed it on the lips of someone else. That's transferal. Let me give you an example. Now, I mentioned to you Pompey. In the year 53, Rome was in a state of great chaos, and so they resorted. Cato proposed there's only one way to save the state. Let's take Pompey. He's not the best leader, but he's probably the best that we have at this point. And let's appoint him sole consul and give him almost absolute power. And so the Senate goes ahead, they do that, and in 52 BC, Pompey takes over as sole consul. Pompey does a number of good things, enacts some laws, cleans up things, violence and chaos begins to subside in Rome. One of the laws that Pompey introduces is to say, if there's a defendant on trial, someone can't, on behalf of their friend, come into the court and read what's called an encomium. That would be a speech with lavish praise. So, this guy's on trial for adultery, which they would try you for back then. So, he's on trial for adultery. Well, I know he's on trial for adultery, but this is a great guy right here. He's given a lot of money to the poor. He's done this, he's done this, he's done this. He's a great... Of course, that has nothing to do with whether he's guilty, right? So Pompey says you can't do that anymore. You can't come in and read an encomium for a defendant. And then Pompey proceeds to break his own law. So this is reported by a number of historians. Plutarch reports it on 2 occasions. So first, in Plutarch's Life of Cato, you like my stick figures? Pompey's friend Plancus is on trial. There's another name for you all, for your sons later on, Plancus. So Pompey, his friend Plancus is on trial, and so what Pompey does is he writes an encomium, and he sends it in to be read at the trial by one of his emissaries. And his emissary reads it at the trial. And we know this is probably what happened because there are multiple historians of that period, other historians who report it the same way. But when Plutarch reports the same event in his Life of Pompey, it's Pompey himself who goes into the city of Rome and reads it himself at the trial of his friend Plancus. So I can hear Bart Ehrman now. Did Pompey send an emissary in and read it? Or did he send someone, or did he go in himself? It depends which Life of Plutarch you read. So, but what's going on here? Well, that's transferal. It's the same author reporting the same event using the same sources. So this is deliberate that he's doing. Why does he do it? Because this is the life of Pompey. This is the biography of Pompey. And it's really an inconsequential detail whether he sent an emissary or whether he went himself. So Plutarch, just to showcase Pompey here, because Pompey's is certainly behind this encomium, he just has it delivered by Pompey's lips. That's it. No big deal. All right. This happens, I could give you numerous examples of this occurring in Plutarch's life. So the question is, do we see this going on in the gospel? Yes, we do. Let me just give you an example here. I'll give you 2 examples. One's a bonus one, all right? So the first one, we go to the Gospel of Luke, and there's a story about a centurion who has a servant who is very sick, and the servant is very valuable to the centurion. And so the centurion sends some Jewish elders, Jewish leaders, to go speak to Jesus, and they come up to him and say, hey, you've got this friend, he's a centurion, he's got this servant, and the servant is really, really sick. And this centurion is worthy of your help. He has given money, he loves the Jewish people, he's given money to help build our synagogue. Please come help him. So Jesus says, all right, let's go. So they start off, and as they're on the way, the centurion gets word of this, and so he sends some friends to go intercept Jesus and says, no. The centurion says he's not worthy to have you come under his house, but he's a man of authority just like you. And he's got soldiers, and to one soldier he says, go, and he goes. And another says, come, and he comes. And to a servant he says, a slave he says, do this, and he does it. So Jesus, the centurion says, because you've got authority, just say the word, and the centurion's servant will be healed. That's what the centurion said. Jesus says, wow, that's some great faith. Go ahead. And he's healed. Well, that's how the story is told in Luke. What's interesting is when you come to Matthew, however, it's the centurion himself who goes to see Jesus and says, I've got this servant who's really sick. Please help him. Jesus says, all right, let's go. And the centurion says, no. You don't understand. I'm not worthy to have you come under my house. So, look, I'm a man of authority just like you. I do this, yada, yada. Just say the word. And so Jesus says, wow, this is some great faith. And he heals his servant. So, I guess you could say, well, did the centurion himself go, or did the centurion never see it? It depends which one of Plutarch's lives you read. Just like you would say about the Gospels. But this is not a contradiction. I mean, I guess you could say in a very wooden sense it is. But remember, we are not looking at modern biography because the generic conventions of modern biography didn't come around until the 18th century. So, listen, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Plutarch, they did not get together and form this committee for the misleading of future historians. They had generic conventions that they worked with under the genre of Greco-Roman biography, and we can see it happening here. Matthew is just shortening the story here. You know, I've been married. Next month will be 28 years, and if anybody's who's married in here, anybody? Quite a few, okay. You all know what I'm talking about when I say there's the guy version of the story, and there's the girl version of the story, right? The girl version of the story, details, lots of details. Girls want to know what happened, when it happened, why it happened, how it happened, who was there, what they were wearing, what they were saying, what they thought, and how they felt. And how you feel about it. The guy version of the story is completely different. We want bullet points. Get to the bottom line. The game's coming on in 5 minutes. You know? We don't hesitate to alter some details at times so that we don't have to give a 5 to 10 minute background introduction to this. We just want to get to the bottom line. All right? That's the guy version. It's not we don't try to distort the truth or things like that. We just try to abbreviate things. All right? So that's the difference. Matthew typically gives us the guy version of the story. Mark gives us the girl version of the story. Okay? All right. Here's another example of transferal. In the Gospel of Matthew, you've got James and John, the sons of Zebedee, two of Jesus' 12 disciples, and their mother. They approach Jesus, and they come up, and Jesus says, what can I do for you all? And the mother says, hey, when you come into your kingdom, Jesus, I would like for one of my sons to sit on your right and one on your left. And Jesus says to them, turns to James and John, well, can you drink the cup that I'm going to be drinking? Yep. Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I'm about to be baptized? He's referring to suffering and death. And they say, yep. And he says, well, you will drink the cup I'm going to drink. You will be baptized with the baptism with which I'll be baptized. But to sit on my right and left when I come to my kingdom, that's up to my Father. And of course they walk away and they say, thanks a lot, Mom. Don't ever try to help us again. So that's Matthew. When we read the same story in Mark, Mark brushes the mother out of the text. You don't even hear about her, and it's James and John who approach Jesus, and he says, what can I do for you? And James and John say, when you come into your kingdom, we'd like to sit on the right or left. So they transfer it from what the mom said to the sons, because ultimately it was the sons behind it, right? Just like it was Pompey behind who read the encomium. So these are just a couple of examples of transferal in the New Testament. There are several others. I'll just give you another bonus one, okay? This is a real quick one. The scribe at one point comes up to Jesus and says, hey, what's the greatest commandment of all? And Jesus responds, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you will love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You'll love your neighbors yourself. And the scribe says, yep, you've answered right. When you read it in another gospel, the scribe comes up and says to Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, well, what do you think? And the scribe says, well, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbors yourself. And Jesus says, you've answered well. So who said to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? Who gave the answer? We don't know. One of the gospel authors has transferred the answer to someone else, but they were both in accord and they were agreed upon. So you find this a lot throughout the Gospels. Let's go to a second compositional device. By the way, I've found several, but I'm only going to give you 3 different types tonight, okay? Spotlighting, or you could call it literary spotlighting. This is when an author directs focus on his subject to the point that he neglects to mention others who were likewise involved. Think about a theater. You've been to a theatrical performance, you see a bunch of actors, actresses on the stage, and all of a sudden the lights go out and a spotlight shines on a single person. You know others are there, but the spotlight is shining on one person, so that's all you see. In a similar way, literary spotlighting is when the author knows others are present, but he only mentions one. You get the idea that it's just one person being involved in this, but you know from other writings that there were more than one. Let me give you, oh, by the way, this, from what I noticed in Plutarch, is more common than any other compositional device that I noticed. So let me give you an example. The Catilinarian conspiracy of 63 BC. There's this guy named Catiline. He was a Roman senator, and he wanted to become consul, but he got defeated twice. Cicero beat him one time, and then another guy beat him another time. And so he's pretty bitter about it. And so he gets some guys together, and they plan to overthrow the government. They're going to kill all the senators, and they're going to kill Cicero, who was consul at that point. And by the way, many of you thought, oh, Cicero's a great orator, right? Yes, he was. But he was also consul at one point. And at one point, he was the most powerful man in Rome. So anyway, Cicero's consul at this point, and so they plan to kill all the senators, kill Cicero, and the other consul, and then they're going to burn the city and start over. Well, word of this gets to Crassus. I mentioned Crassus to you. So word gets to Crassus because someone, an anonymous person, drops off a bunch of letters addressed to the Senate, the senators, the one to Crassus. And so he reads it, and then informing him of the rebellion to come. And so Crassus comes to Cicero's house at night with 2 other guys, a guy named Metellus and another named Marcellus. So the 3 of them come to Cicero's house, and they wake him up and they deliver these letters to Cicero, and Crassus reads his own to Cicero. And then the next day, Cicero calls the Senate, and they capture the conspirators. Okay, we'll look at that in a moment. So that's in the life of Cicero. You have these 3 guys, Crassus, Metellus, and Marcellus, who come and present the letters to Cicero. But in Plutarch's life of Crassus, he shines his literary spotlight on Crassus. So at that point, he only mentions Crassus coming to the house of Cicero at night. He knows the others are there. But this is the life of Crassus. Crassus is the only one that matters at that point. Crassus was the one doing the speaking, even in the other one, the main person there. So he only mentions Crassus. Again, he's aware of the others there, but he only mentions Crassus. So let's proceed with that story. I said the next day Cicero calls the Senate together, and they capture these guys. And so Cicero is saying, what do we do here? What am I supposed to do? So Caesar, who's not, the man of great power yet, but he is rising to power at this point, he gets up and he says, well, what we should do is we should take these guys, and you can't execute them without trial, so let's put them in jail somewhere, wait till we find Catiline and crush his army, and then we'll put these guys on trial, and we'll also seize all their property and keep that. Well, at that point, according to the life of Caesar and the life of Cicero, Catulus and Cato get up and they say, all right, no, you can't do that. These guys tried to overthrow Rome and destroy and kill you all and kill us all, and we're going to burn the city. They need to be put to death. And, no trial right now, but we know they're guilty. Let's put them to death. And so they convinced the Senate, Cicero, to do that, and the conspirators are executed. So that's how the story is told in the life of Caesar and the life of Cicero. But when you come to the life of Cato, again, same author writing all 3 of these, When you come to the life of Cato, Plutarch shines his literary spotlight on Cato. Catullus, we know, was there, but he doesn't mention him. And readers get the impression that it was Cato alone who stood up and opposed Caesar and persuaded the Senate to execute the conspirators. So that's called spotlighting. Follow me on that? Okay? Seems pretty simple. We probably do it today all the time if you think about it. Now, when we come to the Gospels, there are several places in the Gospels where we might see spotlighting go on, literary spotlighting. And just to focus on a section of the Gospels, let's look at the resurrection narratives. So, Ehrman and in our debate said, all right, how many angels were at the tomb? Matthew and Mark say 1, Luke and John say 2. So, could it be that Matthew and Mark are just shining their literary spotlight on the angel who's announcing that Jesus has been raised? They know another angel is there, but it really doesn't matter because it's the one who's doing the talking. It'd be kind of like if I go home, when I get home late Saturday night, my wife says, whoa, about an hour ago, the doorbell rang and this guy was there with this real big check from Publishers Clearinghouse saying we won $15 million. Pretty cool. And then an hour after that, I hear her talking to her mom and said, hey, it's pretty cool. You know, about 2 hours ago, there's a doorbell rang, and there's these two guys at the door, and one had this big check from Publishers Clearinghouse, and the other was videotaping it. I wouldn't get off the phone and say, you contradicted yourself. She was shining her spotlight on the one with the check, because that's the one that really mattered, right? The one that's announcing the resurrection of Jesus is the one that matters. So maybe that's what's going on there. Well, is there any other examples of spotlighting within the resurrection narratives? Yes, there is. How many women went to the tomb? Matthew, Mark, and Luke report that there were multiple women. Some are named, some more of them are named in other accounts. And when you come to the Gospel of John, John only mentions Mary Magdalene. Early in the morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene got up, went to the tomb, found it empty. So was it one woman or were there many? It's real interesting to note the next verse in the Gospel of John. After he says Mary Magdalene got up, ran to the tomb, and found it empty, she came back and reported to Peter and the beloved disciple, they have taken the Lord, and we don't know where they've laid him. Who's we? Well, maybe that's Peter, John, and Mary. Maybe, but why would she say, we don't know? They didn't even know the tomb was empty, right? Until Mary told them. So it would make more sense that there are other women there. All right, so that's a possibility. Let's look at another one. So who runs to the tomb? Well, who ran to the tomb? According to the Gospel of Luke, when the women reported it, Peter got up and ran to the tomb. When you come to the Gospel of John, it's Peter and the beloved disciple who get up and run to the empty tomb. So which one is it? Well, it's really interesting that in the Gospel of Luke, after Peter goes to the tomb, he sees it's empty, and then he goes home baffled of what's going on. Later that day, Jesus is talking to the two Emmaus disciples, and they're walking along, and Luke says that Jesus kept them from recognizing him. And so he says, so why the long faces, guys? And they say, well, are you the only one in Jerusalem that doesn't know what's happened? And Jesus says, no, what? He's playing with them. Must have been kind of fun, huh? And, well, we had this Jesus guy. We thought he's a prophet. We thought he was the Messiah. But on Friday, the Romans crucified him. But this morning, some of our women folk went to the tomb, and they found it empty and saw some angels. And then some of our own went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. Well, wait a minute, Luke. Just 12 verses earlier, you only mentioned Peter. That's right. So, but Luke, you only mentioned Peter, just Peter. That's right. You said just Peter went. No, I didn't say just Peter. I only mentioned Peter. He's the lead disciple. But it's obvious that I know that there were others because 12 verses later I said some of our own went to the tomb. But Peter, we don't do that today. That's your problem. It's not a contradiction. It's an obvious case of spotlighting. So we see one certain example and two other possible to probable examples of spotlighting going on just in the resurrection narratives. These aren't contradictions. All right, let's look at one more. Simplification. Simplification occurs when an author adapts his material by omitting details that may complicate the literary portrait of the subject he is painting. Now, I mentioned, well, I didn't. Let me introduce you to one other. I'll give you a second. I see some of you writing this down. I'll give you a second. There's one other figure I didn't mention, and that's Brutus. Brutus is the guy that was involved in assassinating Caesar. By the way, you know that sentence in Shakespeare, et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus? Some of the ancient, I think Suetonius says it's you too, my son. But Suetonius and Cassius Dio both say that even though there were some reports that Caesar said that, they both doubted it. So it's doubtful that Caesar actually uttered that statement. Anyway, so Brutus, by Roman standards, was a pretty good guy, by Roman standards. He was principled just like Cato for the most part. People really liked him. He was very honest, a lot of integrity. They trusted him. So after he assassinated Caesar, and people are like, whoa, what's going on here? When they found out that Brutus was involved, oh, okay, well, it must be a good thing then. So people really liked Brutus. And so when you read about Brutus in Plutarch's Life of Brutus, he's a really mild guy, a lot of honesty, and really looking out for others. But what Plutarch doesn't do is report what we find in other ancient writings, like Cicero. In one of his letters that has survived, Cicero mentions how Brutus made a loan, approved a loan to the city of Cyprus at a rate of 48% a year, and it crippled the city, and he did it to benefit some of his friends. And there's some other things. He divorced his wife so he could marry someone else, and all this stuff. So he was there. Oh, and another time when he defeated a city, he allowed all his soldiers to go in and steal and rape and all this, the victors, whereas he had prevented that before, but he did that to appease his soldiers. So there were moral hiccups in Brutus's life, but Plutarch never mentions that. And the reason being is Plutarch is painting a literary portrait of Brutus, which is what biography was. It was a portrait. You want the objective of ancient biography was to paint a portrait of the person's character, so you could see what kind of a person this was, who this person really was on the inside. And so by saying, I mean, people do dumb things in their lives. People do things they regret. Of course, I've done it. We've all done it. We will do it in our lives. And so Plutarch's thinking, well, I don't want Brutus to be remembered by a couple moral hiccups he had. Let me give them the true Brutus so that they understand it. So he omits those things so that people don't focus on the negative thing and they don't get a misconception. That's simplification. Simplification occurs in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of John. When we read all four Gospels about Jesus in the garden right before he's arrested, Matthew, Mark, and Luke portray Jesus as suffering greatly. In fact, he prays, God, Father, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me. If at all possible, he wants out if possible. But when you come to the Gospel of John, there's very little said about Jesus, really struggling over this. It's like, yep, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, let this cup pass from me. But when you come to John, Jesus says to Peter, shall I ask the Father to deliver me from this cup? No, I was born for this hour. It's a simplification. Why? Because John has very clearly in here, and so do the other Gospels actually, but John, more in language Westerners can appreciate, is presenting Jesus as God's divine Son. And it complicates that portrait in the minds of perhaps some of his readers, how God's divine Son could seem weak at the time of his crucifixion and when he had actually come to atone for and actually die for our sins. When you read the Jewish martyrdom literature, of which there's quite a bit from antiquity, all the Jewish martyrs go to their deaths like really bold. Go ahead and kill me, I don't care. It's like racks and stones may break my bones, but resurrection awaits me. And at the end of their life, you find a number of these Jewish martyrs saying, I have not forsaken your law. But in the Gospels, we have Jesus saying, God, why have you forsaken me? It's different. Well, the Jewish martyrdom literature, we can tell, is embellished. I could give you so many stories like this that it's obvious embellishment to honor that person as well as to provide accounts that when read by others who were facing potentially similar situations, it could encourage them. We don't have that in the Gospels. We have, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are presenting Jesus in his divinity and his humanity. And he's really struggling with being crucified. John kind of brushes that out. He brushes that suffering aspect out. And it's the Jesus that's like, come on, bring it on. Who do you see? Jesus of Nazareth. I'm he. And, now I'm not going to ask God the path. So this is a simplification that's going on here. It's not a contradiction. It's in order to simplify the portrait so that it wouldn't be misinterpreted. All right, so let's bring this to a close and then we'll open up for Q&A. What does this have to do when we come to historical reliability? Historical reliability is a funny term. What is historical reliability when you look at this? Well, I think we've got to consider genre and take that into consideration. When the psalmist talks about God sleeping, awake you who are sleeping, he says of God. Are we really to think that God was sleeping? No. Well, does that mean the psalmist was in error? No. Because this is a poetic kind of genre. We expect this kind of stuff. When we read in Proverbs that there's a woman standing on top of the roof named Wisdom, and she's crying out to all the simpletons, come to me and I will make you wise. Are we really to think that there's a woman named Wisdom standing on top of a roof yelling this down? No. So we don't think that's not an error, though. When Jesus is telling a parable, if we were to say, well, that person, the Good Samaritan, didn't really exist, that's a fictitious character, is that an error? No. Now, if this thing happened in modern biography and they changed details like that, we might say we got an error. But ancient biography allowed certain flexibility in the way things were reported, as we saw. They allowed transferal and spotlighting and compression and all this kind of stuff, and there was displacement, and weird stuff that they did with chronology. Gosh, the events that led up to Caesar's crossing the Rubicon and what happened right after that, it baffles even classicists today. Even how Plutarch reports the same event. We can't figure out what he's doing. But it's the same guy telling the same story. They had literary conventions that they went by, and they were operating by those, and we have to judge them according to how they followed those conventions rather than imparting our ideas of modern precision upon them. The events themselves happen. So no one questions whether Pompey put together an encomium and had it read during the trial of Plancus. But whether Pompey was there or sent an emissary could be questioned. And things like that. Was it James, John, and their mother who asked Jesus to put them on thrones next to Jesus? Or was the mother not there? Well, we can take an educated guess that transferal is being used there, but if we're wrong, it still doesn't change the fact that James and John wanted to, and they requested of Jesus, whether it was their mouth or through their mother, they requested of Jesus to sit on his right and his left. It doesn't change anything. Were there one angels or two angels? Well, perhaps Matthew and Mark are spotlighting, but if not, if something else is going on, it doesn't change the fact of the empty tomb, or whether they saw at least an angel there, or something like that. Okay?
amateur photography is kind of it's a hobby. And so I appreciate interesting photographs. And you know, you think about a meadow like this on a sunny day, and you might see a couple walking through it holding hands, and it's pretty romantic, right? Nobody objects if a photographer photoshops that a little bit and casts a little haze to emphasize the romantic element of that moment. Now, we would get on that person if they altered the photograph to the point where the sky was cloudy and it was raining, right? Because that would alter what really happened. But we're not going to get on someone like this. We wouldn't say, hey, that's a mistake. This is an error because it didn't look fuzzy like that. We would appreciate that artistic change there in order to emphasize the romantic element of the moment. The gospel authors, not just them, but ancient authors, ancient biographers and historians did the same thing, and they did it on a regular basis. We can see it in Plutarch, we can see it in other ancient biographers, and we can see the gospel authors doing it, and we would expect them to do it since they're writing a Greco-Roman biography. So I guess in closing I'd say, scholars look at these ancient texts, and a lot of times the problem, as we see with Ehrman, is he is looking through the lens of a camera lens in the distant past, and it's focused using the rules of modern biography. But when you adjust that lens and focus it using the rules of ancient biography, a whole lot more comes into focus. So I hope that's helpful. We could go into a lot more. But that just kind of gives you an introduction to why there are differences in the Gospels.
Hey, Dr. Licona. My name is Whitney Sanders. I'm graduated from Wofford College a couple years ago. It's just down south. My question, I'm a Christian. I believe the scriptures are God's word to us. So I'm wondering, as a Christian, looking at these differences in the Gospels, do they help us understand the nature of truth, the nature of who God is and what He's trying to communicate to us?
Good question. Well, the differences themselves, the presence of differences like this, I don't think it adds any insight to who God is or anything like that. But I think it tells us as Christians, I think it helps us to understand what we have in the Gospels more. We see these kinds of changes going on, and they were deliberate. So, like for myself, I was raised in a pretty conservative Christian family. So when I started to see some of these things, you know, after I concluded Jesus rose from the dead, it didn't matter as much to me. But I understood that it mattered to a lot of my evangelical friends, and it troubled a lot of them. I remember a student, we watched, one of my classes, we watched a debate between Ehrman and I, and then we commented in between, and at the end the student said, well, you never addressed the issue of contradictions. And I said, well, yeah, because we were debating on the resurrection, and that really doesn't impact the resurrection. And she said, I know, but it really kind of rocks my world when it comes to the gospel, or to the Bible, and my trust in the Bible, and she had tears in her eyes. So at that point, I realized, well, you know, okay, I need to really look into this, and that's what motivated me to do it. So what this study over the last 6.5 years has forced me to do is to recalibrate what I'm reading when I come to the Gospels. I'm not actually, all the time. Obviously, Jairus is, that's a different story. Well, the centurion, did the centurion come to see Jesus, or did he send emissaries? If I had been there, what would I have actually seen? Probably the emissaries, the Jewish elders, and then his friends. So that means when I'm reading Matthew, it's not reporting things precisely what I would have seen had I been there. And so we can say that about the Gospels, and we can say it about Plutarch's lives, and we can say it about just about all of ancient history and biography, that a lot of the stories aren't going to be an exact description of what we would have seen had we been there. We're going to get a really, really good gist, But there's going to be some details that, because of the compositional devices, it's going to be a little different. So I had to just recalibrate my thinking of what to expect when I come to the Gospels. Skeptics like Ehrman, though, need to recalibrate their thinking, because their view of the Gospels are every bit as wooden and inflexible. So they have to come to appreciate the Gospels as ancient biographies and the conventions they operate by, and understand that these aren't contradictions. So this doesn't necessarily show that the Gospels are historically reliable. We would go by other means, multiple independent sources, early sources, eyewitness sources, unsympathetic sources, things like that, and we can establish reliability of some things. But these differences in the Gospels by no means undermine the historical reliability of the Gospels, as people like Ehrman would have us think. Does that help?
Yeah.
Mine's kind of quick. All the examples you've given are, in fact, like details where you're right, Dave. They really don't affect the punchline. If you were debating you, what's the closest you get to in any of the Gospels or the rest of the Bible where you'd say, the meaning is really not the exact same, and, what would be your big whammy against yourself, if you don't mind?
The whammy against myself. Well, I'll just repeat the words of Jesus. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. So I'm not going to go down that road. There are still a handful of discrepancies, differences in the Gospels that I haven't been able to explain through the compositional devices that I've looked at up to this point. But they don't change anything like any major doctrine or anything like that. I'd rather not say what they are, just because I don't want some of you walking away and it's like, oh no, I can't resolve that one. God, there's no reason for living anymore. And some of you might be that way, so I don't want to give you that. I think there was that gentleman there with the beard. Santa Claus.
Actually, they call me at work. I'm Dan Trout, I'm an alumni of Columbia International University, which is called Columbia Bible College. The premise of my question is that you're focusing on men trying to reconcile writings with men. Now, if I was to write the same thing to the computer programmers in the room, or to the athletes in the room, or to the theater students in the room, those three writings are going to be different because of the audience. Now, why did the Holy Spirit inspire 4 Gospels? It's because they were written to 4 different groups of people with 4 different understandings of how things work. And so, although I understand what you're trying to present, the question really isn't, do the Gospels contradict each other? The question is, does our understanding as men and women, are they contradictory from other people? So, when you're talking about viewing the Gospels through other literary writings, having worked in journalism, here's my question. If you have a journalist who is a liberal Democrat, they're going to report and write differently than a conservative Republican. So if you take the writings of a humanist, Greco-Roman culture, and try to interpret Scripture, which is completely the opposite of humanism, how in the world are you going to get accuracy? Because it would be like asking a liberal Democrat from CNN to try to report a story in the way Fox News is going to report it.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. There's so many examples I could give, but let's say Jairus comes to Jesus in Mark and Luke and says, my daughter's about to die, please come and heal her. So Jesus says, all right, let's go. On the way, some servants from Jairus' house come out and they say, don't trouble Jesus anymore, your daughter has just died. And Jesus says, don't worry about it, have faith. And then they go to the house and they raise Jairus' daughter from the dead. Now, in Matthew's account, Jairus comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, my daughter has just died. Please come and heal her. And Jesus says, all right, let's go. And they go, and the servants don't come out because she's already dead. So was Jairus' daughter dead or alive? It has nothing to do with politics. It has nothing to do with like car accident, people viewing it from different things. She was either dead or about to die. Matthew says she was already dead. Mark and Luke said she was about to die. Now, how do you explain that apart from a compositional device, such as compression? I can do that through compression. Plutarch does it. The ancient authors do it. I see the gospel authors doing it often on different things. If the Gospels are going to write according to a certain genre, I can explain it that way. So, the Holy Spirit, if the Scriptures are divinely inspired, I think that they are. If the Holy Spirit's going to inspire them and they're writing according to a genre, I don't think the Holy Spirit's going to say, hey, these literary conventions, just set them aside. I'm going to do my own thing here. He doesn't do that with any other part of the Bible. He goes by the literary conventions of that particular literature. Why would the Gospels be any exception to that?
Well, I can answer that by using the example of the cock crow once or the cock crow twice. Well, if you really want to know about chickens, you should be at a different university. That's down USC. But for a simple country boy, I know that when a rooster crows.
Well, talk about Jairus. How would you do with the Jairus thing?
Well, actually, I am answering your question. But I guess those who interrupt more than they listen, you have some issues. Now,
Do you have another question?
he asked me a question and I'm answering his question. Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Those of us who are simple country boys know that when a rooster crows, he crows in pairs. So to say the rooster crowed once and the rooster crowed twice, which is correct? Yes, they both are. The problem isn't with the crowing of the rooster. The problem is with our understanding of facts. And since I wasn't there, I'm not going to weigh in and say this is a contradiction or this was written differently for a specific reason. The facts that we agree on is that the event did happen and Jesus did raise the girl from the dead. That's what we have in common. But I'm not going to apply a liberal point of view and say it justifies a conservative point of view.
No, I wouldn't call what I presented a liberal point of view. What I would say is it does challenge an overly wooden view of the Scriptures, which we have to, listen, I have a high view of Scripture. I believe the Scriptures are divinely inspired and reliable. But whatever view we have of Scripture, it has to be in concert with what we observe in Scripture. And what I fear I see you doing, sir, with all respect, is you come to the Scriptures with a high view of Scripture, okay? But you're applying 21st century rules to first century literature, rules that they didn't have then. And you're basically saying, all right, God, this is the way you should have written it. This is the way I think you should have written it. And now you're trying to squeeze the Gospels to fit that mold. And where do you get that mold? Why must the Scriptures conform to 21st century modern biography, the conventions?
I said there's four molds. Matthew's mold, Mark's mold, Luke's mold, John's mold. For four different molds of people.
Yeah,
That's
and
why-
I agree. But the one mold they fit under, in my opinion, and we disagree, but they're ancient biographies, so they go by those things. Well, thanks for your comments.
So for the most part tonight, you were mentioning a lot of Plutarch's writing, but you also mentioned that you looked at other writers at the time that were writing biographies, and I was wondering what other writers you were looking at, and if they talked about some of the stories you heard.
Well, there's Suetonius's. Suetonius, he wrote the 12 Caesars, so those are 12 biographies, 12 lives of the different Caesars, starting with Julius Caesar and Augustus, and the 12 of them that way. You have Diogenes Laertius. I'm trying to think of some of the others I have. You got Tacitus's biography of his father-in-law, Agricola. So there are a few like that that are writing around the same time.
Will those be mentioned in the book that you're writing too?
No, because the difference is they're not telling the same stories over and over. So one could devote their academic career to looking at these, and some really do. But what I like about Plutarch is the same author using, in many cases, the same sources, reporting the same story multiple times, and differences appear. So we can infer these compositional devices with a greater amount of certainty than when we look at how different historians report the same event.
Hey, my name is Mark Wilson. I just had a question regarding the omission literary device you're talking about. So when it's in the Gospel, it refers to Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and the eyes of the man and God from like 12 to 30, and that's all it mentions. Could you conceivably, just reversing the mindset, if you're coming from a negative view of the Gospel, could you use that to justify saying Jesus wasn't really inerrant, Jesus didn't really not sin, that was just the portrayal of him, it was just a sort of a good portrayal of Jesus, leaving out the things that he might have done wrong?
I guess someone could say that. I don't know that that's the best explanation. It's pretty standard in ancient biography, it's pretty standard that you would open up by talking about the lineage through which that person came, and then it jumps to from there. It doesn't usually talk about their childhood. From there, it usually jumps from their birth or lineage to their adult life where they start to make an impact. And you find that in Plutarch, you find that in Suetonius. It's pretty common in ancient biography. So the fact that Jesus' childhood is omitted from the Gospels is right in line with what you find in ancient biography. And look at this buff guy. You make me feel real weak. Thank you. Excuse me, is the beach this way?
Does the reality of the literary dependence of the Gospels cause even a greater challenge for you than the contradictions? Because skeptics can easily claim that it can deny inspiration on that basis alone. And have you ever considered rejecting, the so-called, the dependence that scholars in the last 200 years have found between the Gospels? Could you present an alternate theory? Not that I think there is.
No, I'm pretty much in agreement with that. I think it's most scholars today think that Mark wrote first, that Matthew and Luke they used Mark as one of their sources. They had other sources. Luke, in the first 3 verses of his gospel, said there were many others and who wrote gospels, and he got his information from the eyewitnesses. I think we should expect Matthew and Luke to use Mark because, according to early church tradition, Mark got his information from Peter. Peter was the lead apostle, so Mark would have been authoritative. At that point, it was common for ancient biographers to use a primary source and supplement it with others. Moreover, Peter was privy to some events that the other disciples weren't, like the Transfiguration. Jesus took Peter, James, and John. Or the raising of Jairus' daughter, he took Peter, James, and John and told the others, you can't come. Or when he went to pray in the garden, he took Peter, James, and John. So Peter, behind that gospel, is going to be pretty authoritative. So why not, if you're Matthew or Luke, why not use that? Them as your primary source, and then supplement it with your own stuff that you know. And then John writes later, probably, so he would have been an eyewitness, and so he's going to supplement with some other stuff.
And relatedly, how would you explain the minor agreements?
The what?
The minor agreements on Matthew and Luke story, Mark and stories, Matthew and Luke, where Matthew and Luke agree against Mark.
Yeah, or that Mark doesn't report it, you mean?
Well, no. Matthew and Luke have source material from Mark, and they're telling it, but Matthew and Luke agree as if that there's word-for-word similarities between Matthew and Luke.
I have no problem with that.
No, like, how can you explain that? Like, there's like a few examples of 5 word similarities.
Well, it's more than that. You know, when you
No,
look at
5 words in a row.
yeah, when you look at
Like, how can that be, I mean,
well, a number of ways that can be explained. You can explain it oral tradition. Oral tradition was huge back then. Literacy rate was only about 10%. And people's memories were far better than ours today because they didn't have television, they didn't have the internet or anything like that that they could look at, or DVDs. So people back then were known to memorize volumes that would be unthinkable for us today. So I'm 53, and those around my age or older remember that if we wanted to call someone back in the 1990s, we either recalled their number from memory or we looked it up in our day plan or something. Today, if I want to call someone, I can't tell you what my son's or daughter's phone number is. All I do is I tell my phone, push the button, say, call Zach, and it calls. I don't know what the phone number, I don't need to know. So as a result of modern technology, it changes the way we live, and oral traditions vanished from Western culture, but it was big back then, and they had checks and balances and how to do it and how much you could vary, and a lot of work has been done on this during the last 60 years. So it could be oral tradition that had been memorized. There could have been what scholars refer to as the Q source. I have no problems with that, since Luke says there were others that wrote stuff. Q might have been a written document for all we know. It could have been notes that the disciples took. Disciples of their rabbis and teachers it was common for them to take notes and to take them with them and repeat their mentor's message. And so we could expect the disciples have done this. Q just might have been from their notes. And so we have Matthew and Luke using that. Could have been another written source. We just don't know. But yeah, I mean, you've got things like when Jesus says someone greater than Jonah is here, someone greater than Solomon is here. You're looking at more than 30 words that are back to back. Or asking it shall be given, seeking you will find, knocking the door shall be opened. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, everyone who knocks. Those are word for word in Greek in the gospel. So that's oral tradition or a common source. I don't have any problem with that at all. But did I answer your question?
well, actually, I've heard, there's probably, 5-10% of scholars want to reject market priority. And they want...
How many?
Less than 10%.
Yeah, less than
10%.
And I'm fine with market priority.
No, but I'm saying, the example I just gave was an example, like a reason to reject market priority. Because Luke and Matthew took a story, not a cute story, a Mark story, right?
Which one are you thinking?
I don't have it off the top of my head.
Okay.
It's just the minor agreements, it's called, where Matthew and Luke agree from a Markan story. And Matthew and Luke have the same word order, but it's different from Mark.
Right.
So the only way that can be explained is if either Luke's copying Matthew or Matthew's copying Luke, which was something
or they're using a common source.
Yes. Well, the common source was Mark, but how can they? But if they wrote,
how do we know that?
Because Mark has a story too.
Yeah, but how do we know there's not more than one reporting the same
possible.
story?
Of course. I was just bringing this up, that I didn't know that you actually strongly held to market priority, or if you doubted it, or any reasons you doubted it.
No, I hold to market priority. I think the evidence is convincing for it, but I wouldn't die for it. I think it's very possible that Matthew wrote his gospel first, but it's not the gospel of Matthew we have today, because Papias says that Matthew wrote his gospel in Aramaic or Hebrew. So I think it's possible that Matthew wrote the gospel in Aramaic, and then later on, it was a smaller one than what we have. Later on, someone came along, translated it into Greek, and then took stuff from Mark, and then maybe some other stuff from other sources, combined it, and that's the Matthew we have today. I have no problem with that, and so in a sense you could say Matthew was first there, but not the Matthew we have today, because it includes part of Mark. The interdependence of the Gospels is, as you probably know, called the synoptic problem, is something that it's a fascinating subject. And whether you take Markan priority or Matthew priority, or you embrace Q or you reject Q, there's no solution that solves all the problems. So it's probably more complex and more sources that are involved than we're aware of. And maybe a lot of them are just oral tradition because it was an oral culture, and that kind of confuses us in the written culture. So, good question. I think you said we're going to 9. Is that right? So we got a couple more minutes. Okay, a couple more. By the way, if any of you are interested in seeing some of the debates in which I've been involved or some lectures, that's my website. You can also follow me on Twitter or Facebook, but that's my website. You can go there and view any number of debates or lectures. Is that working?
Okay. Quick hermeneutic question. The two accounts of the genealogy of Jesus, one in Matthew, one in Luke. What is your take on the discrepancies between those two?
Yeah, good question. We were talking about that at lunch today, I think, weren't we? So some have said, well, one's the genealogy of Mary, it's Mary's side, the other's Joseph. No, that's not the case, but they both go back to David. Matthew's kind of interesting. Matthew has less generations than Luke does. And what's really interesting, what caught my attention was Matthew really seems to be interested in numbers. So he goes through all of these, and then he summarizes it in Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. He says, so these are all the generations. There are a total of 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus. There are 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the deportation to Babylon, and 14 from the deportation to Jesus. In all, there are 42. He said, 3 sets of 14. What's going on here? Because he's saying there are 42, right? Well, there are more than 42 if you look at Luke. And if you go back to Chronicles, you find out that there are some generations that Matthew left out. You also find that in these 3 sets of 42, Matthew cheated. And the 14th one in the second set he uses again in the third set. So it's really 14, 14, and 13. But he says 3 sets of 14. So why is he doing this? Well, in Hebrew, you had a literary device called gematria. And for the ancient Hebrews, gematria, they would assign a numerical value to letters. And it's interesting to note, scholars have noted for some time that Matthew, more than the others, focuses on Jesus' Davidic ancestry, that he's the Messiah. And so the name David has 3 letters in Hebrew, and the 2 D's are worth 4. They're assigned a numerical value of 4, and then the middle is 6. That adds up to 14. So it appears that what Matthew was doing with his genealogy, he alters it a little bit, so that artistically he creates the genealogy to say to the readers, David, David, David. This is all Jesus. He is the son of David, the Messiah. So when you look at it that way, you say, well, this isn't really a contradiction. This is Matthew using Jesus' genealogy, using real generations that are reported in the Old Testament, but he artistically alters the genealogy in order to emphasize Jesus' Davidic ancestry. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, sir. Right behind. Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Hello. All right. So, thanks for coming out. Really enjoyed your lecture. So, what I see is that you covered. What I don't see that you covered, let's go that direction, is discrepancies among translations. So, my question is that, because I guess a specific example would be the Gospel of Mark. Like if you look at it in the King James Version versus like the ESV version, there's like actually a few extra verses like which talk about being able
picking up snakes and
exactly
poison.
Yeah. So what's the deal with that?
Good question. That is Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, and every modern English translation will put those in brackets and have a little footnote that says these verses do not appear in the oldest and best manuscripts that we have. When the King James Version was put together in 1611, the Greek text they used for the New Testament had been put together a few years earlier by a guy named Erasmus. Okay? At that point, Erasmus only had 6 Greek manuscripts by which he put together his Greek New Testament. And the oldest of those was 900 years removed from the original. So from the 10th century. Actually, 11th. Yeah, 10th century. So what we have today, we have, well, as of September of last year, I think it's up to like 5,838 Greek manuscripts. Not 7, about 5,838. And a dozen of them are dated to within 150 years of the original. It's better than we have by far for any other ancient work. The second place is the Homeric epics, and there's just under 2,000. All right, and like the earliest, I think, is 500 years after the original. So we've got a dozen about that are within 150 years of the original. Now we have over 5,800 manuscripts. So, and this ending of Mark, verses 9 through 20, where you pick up snakes and drink poison, it's 99.9%, and I really mean that. 99.9%. There's only a few who would take a contrary view. Even conservative scholars would say that those verses were added in the 2nd century. And the reason being is because, well, they are really strange. And they don't have the same grammar and vocabulary as the rest of Mark. So they do repeat certain things, like the woman going to the tomb. So it repeats part of that story, so it doesn't really seem to fit. So why were those verses put there? Because our best manuscripts end at chapter 16, verse 9, or 16, verse 8, which says, after the angel said, go back and tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus is he's risen from the dead, and he's going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he promised. And he's referring back to chapter 14, verse 28, where Jesus makes that promise. And then it says, the women, out of fear and trembling, ran away and said nothing to no one. And that's how verse 8 ends. So that's kind of weird for the gospel to end that way. Why don't we have any of the appearances? So there's been basically 3 theories that are given for that over the years. Number 1, Mark intended for his gospel to end there. And we're not certain why. And it's kind of like where there's 3 New Testament scholars in the room, there are 5 opinions. Every New Testament scholar writing the commentary has a different reason for why Mark ended at verse 8. So there's no agreement on that whatsoever on why he might have ended there. It's really awkward. The second reason is Mark did not intend for his gospel to end there. And he was unable to finish it. Maybe he died, got sick, or third, the ending was lost. So I tend to think that that's not where Mark, and a growing number of New Testament scholars think, the majority today think that Mark intended to end it there. A growing number of scholars, even some big names, are saying that Mark did not intend to end it there, and either it was lost or he died before he could complete it. So we really don't know. Skeptics like to say, yeah, but Mark's the earliest gospel and it doesn't mention resurrection appearances, so they were invented by Matthew, Luke, and John. But I mean, it's ridiculous because Paul writes before any of the Gospels were written. He mentions all these appearances in 1 Corinthians 15. And Mark, you got Jesus predicting his death, resurrection, and his appearance to them, like in 14:28. After I rise from the dead, I will go ahead of you to Galilee and will appear to you there. And so we expect an appearance of Jesus to the disciples. Mark seems to know about it. So why doesn't he narrate it? Well, again, either it was lost, or he wasn't able to complete it, or he ended it there for some reason, which we don't know why today. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. So those verses were probably not in the originals. You guys are asking great questions.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. So, a large amount of research and debate has gone into how you're supposed to interpret Scripture, both Old Testament and New Testament. And, as you presented today that there's some very specific ways because of the way it was written. You really have to understand ancient history and also have to understand the culture to actually be able to interpret some of the contents correctly. And churches have split and argued, and just people breaking off relationships and just bad things happening over how you're supposed to interpret scripture. And so one common objection that I've heard is that, if you've got an all-powerful God who's sovereign, and he's got this one book, which is his word to you, it's a divine book, the objection very common I hear is, why is it so naturally confusing? Why is the book written in such a way that's so confusing to us?
Yeah, good question. I don't know the answer to that. I can say that it's not just us that misunderstood. I mean, even Peter, 2 Peter refers to Paul's letters and says, a lot of them are difficult to understand. So even Peter seemed to have, some difficulty knowing how to interpret Paul in some things. Then you had people misinterpreting things, like there's a story of Origen, an early church father. We're not certain whether it's a true story, but it was reported that he took one of Jesus' verses that said, "Some made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom," and they performed self-castration. Whether Origen did that or not, even though that's uncertain, we do know that there were several men in the church, in the early church, lots of them. I mean, when I say lots, I don't know how many, but it's more than just a few. And they were taking verses like, Jesus saying, "Some made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom," or if a body member calls you to do sin, cut it off, and they were performing self-castration. And the church had to say, wait a minute, that's not what the verses mean. It isn't? what do you mean? Hermeneutical blunders can have tragic consequences, So can you imagine that? You castrate yourself and, that's not what he meant? So if the ancients didn't, understand, we shouldn't be surprised when there's a noise that's created with 2,000 years separating us that sometimes we don't quite understand what's going on because, they wrote in different ways. Why did God do it that way? I don't know. But he did. Right? He did. The fact is that, we have Jesus talking about the divine inspiration of Scripture, but it doesn't mean that it's absolutely clear to all of us. Obviously, it's not. We have to look at the Scriptures and submit to them and appreciate them as God has given them to us. Maybe we would think we would do it differently, but then if we were in God's shoes, maybe we find that we wouldn't. Why he did it, I don't know. But he did. Does that help? Not really, but...
So this is not something that, someone is asking, you say that. I'm just wondering if there's some ways of explaining this stuff might be more easily relayed to someone.
Yeah. You mean the stuff with the compositional devices? Sure. Yeah, went to my website because I've got some lectures on it. So you don't have to repeat all this to them, but you can just point to my lecture on it. Yeah, but I have found that it's kind of easy to explain it if I say the guy version and the girl version of the story. Oh, I see what you mean. Well, the gospel authors did that too. The cursing of the fig tree, Mark says, well, they got up early one morning and they went to Jerusalem. And all the way Jesus was hungry, he saw a fig tree and there was no fig, so he cursed it. Well, then they went into Jerusalem, and at the end of the day, they left Jerusalem and they went back to Bethany. And the next morning they got up and they had breakfast and they had these big pancakes and Peter had coffee, Jesus wanted decaf and all this stuff. And then they went back to Jerusalem, and on the way Peter saw the tree and says, Lord, the tree you cursed yesterday, it's withered and dry. All right, that's Mark. But Matthew gives us the guy version of the story. He says, they got up, went to Jerusalem, cursed tree, it died. That's it. In fact, Matthew says immediately it died up. He compresses the story. He gives us the guy version of it. And when you express it in that term, the guy versus the girl's version of the story, I find a lot of people can, appreciate that. and kind of, I get it. Well, they're writing, they wrote it in those conventions back then. One more?
You mentioned a number of ways of, I guess, reconciling apparent contradictions in telling the same stories. But how would you go about explaining, I guess, when two different stories are told specifically over the same time frame, specifically in the birth and infant stories in Matthew and Luke?
So how would I reconcile those?
Yeah, like I guess two different stories of Jesus' birth, and then what happens like in the first 2 years of his life are given in both Matthew and Luke. How do you go about explaining those differences?
Well, you remember this handful that I said I can't explain yet? That's one of them. That's that, in my opinion, is the toughest one in the Gospels. By far, it's the toughest. In fact, I'm only aware of one or two others that I'm having difficulty with, and they're just really, really minor details, real minor details. The infancy narratives are the toughest, because what you have there is, in Matthew's account, the Magi come to see Jesus. The Magi are warned not to go by an angel, not to go back to Herod, and then they go a different way. And then an angel appears to Joseph and says, hey, Herod's going to attempt to get out and go to Egypt. So they go to Egypt, and the idea we get is it's a couple years before they come back, and they go to Nazareth. But in Luke's account, they're in Bethlehem, and the shepherds come, they see the angels, the shepherds come. And after the days of purification were up, which I think was 40 days, according to the Old Testament, Jesus and Mary and Jesus, or Joseph, Mary, and Jesus go to Jerusalem. And Jesus is dedicated. And then after that, Luke says they left and went to Nazareth and settled. Wait a minute. That was 40 days after? I thought they went to Egypt and it was a couple weeks up. I don't know how to reconcile this. It could be that Luke is using some compression there, and he's being select, and he's not mentioning the Magi, and he's just covering some other things, and maybe compressing the story. He's leaving out the Egypt thing. Some of that might be going on. I don't know, but could be. I think that's the most difficult in the Gospels to reconcile, and I don't really have an answer for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. For those of you that this is your first introduction to Ratio Christi, I'm very much appreciative of your being here. You have some sense of what we're attempting to do. Probably most everyone here has heard of C.S. Lewis. And he wrote in his book, God in the Dock, there's an essay called Christian Apologetic. And C.S. Lewis says, one must keep on pointing out that Christianity is a statement that, if false, is of no importance. If it is true, it is of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. That is a statement that we ascribe to at Ratio Christi. And we come down definitively saying that Christianity is true. And we exist to help provide evidences and the arguments that have been passed down to us through the history of Christianity for the defense of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so for students, if you have any interest in apologetic questions of any type, we encourage you to come participate with us in Brackett Hall on Monday nights. For everyone that is not a student of Clemson, understand that we don't have hardly any expenses. Really, the only expense we have is when we try to bring someone to campus. And so if you wish for a movement like this to continue nationally, I would encourage you to check out the RatioChristi.org website and donate to it, or you can sponsor our chapter directly. And we hope this is the first of what will be many such events that we will have. Our goal is to have at least one per academic year, hopefully one per semester, to bring in someone of the stature of Dr. Licona. And so if you wish to help us with that, we would appreciate it. This particular event, we had one very, very generous donor. Okay, he is not able to be here, but he basically, well, he did. He paid for enough of this entire event. And so, and people know who it is. And so the person that is related, please know that we're very, very appreciative. Okay, Dr. Licona, it's been
It's been great, more than we could have ever hoped. And for those of you that are here, just so you know, y'all helped me lose a bet. 3 nights ago, the officers and I, we were trying to guess how many people would be here. And I think the high estimate was 280. I had the low estimate at 112.5. And so I lost. So now I'm going to take these 3 out to dinner, and I do it twice over. You know, and we said, right over there where they're sitting, said, let us not limit what God might do. And so, God is good. Good night.